Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and share with you some of my knowledge about Eugene Allen Smith. I've known about him, Alabama's second state geologist, since the 1930s. Now, I understand the original archives here was built by the WPA. Well, my father had to go to work on the WPA in the 1930s, and he was assigned to a group of typists at Smith Hall. They were typing Dr. Smith's journal from yellow second sheets, and they discarded those yellow second sheets. And when there was a particularly interesting entry, my father would bring it home for us to read and enjoy. And I enjoyed Dr. Smith's humor and the wonderful places in Alabama where he went. I was always fascinated and never forgot his accounts of his travels over Alabama in a mule-drawn wagon after the Civil War. In the years that followed in my life, I did not forget him. In the 1990s, I began reading his real journal, just because of my memories of the 1930s. Once again, I was captivated by this brilliant, energetic, honest man. He had a profound impact on our state and its people. I became convinced that more Alabamians should know about Eugene Allen Smith. I read wills, genealogical records, Smith's transcribed field notes, countless numbers of letters he received, and the carbon copies of his replies, and reviewed his published reports over a period of 50 years. I read histories of the state and of the University of Alabama and contemporary newspapers. The book is not technical. I'm no geologist, but I do quote Smith's descriptions of some of the rocks and the creeks that were especially memorable. He makes the reader long to see what he saw, sights that we can see only through his descriptions and his camera. He bought the camera in 1885 and taught himself how to use it. It enabled him to leave a visual record of Alabama in transition. In the latter pages of the book, Smith's family comes more to the fore. He had married Jenny Garland, daughter of the wartime president of the University of Alabama. They had 4 sons and 1 daughter. When the boys reached the age of about 9, they began going out on the summer trips with their father. He even allowed them to take along their dog Bob. Though the book covers the half-century that Smith served as Alabama State Geologist, in this review, I focus only on the first decade of his work because in many ways it's the paradigm for the years that followed. Eugene Allen Smith, Alabama State Geologist, 1873 to 1927, the first decade. From childhood, Eugene Allen Smith was an aggressive and knowledgeable rockhound. He roamed the creek banks and the gullies of his native Autauga County, collecting fossils, Indian artifacts, and rocks for his growing geological cabinet. The hardships of the Civil War did not dim his zeal. As a 21-year-old private in the 33rd Regiment Alabama Volunteers, his sharp eyes were ever alert to his surroundings. Even on forced marches, with meager rations and only mud-hole water to drink, he weighed his knapsack down with rocks, while his weary comrades were discarding their most essential possessions. After the surrender, Smith returned to private life, confident about his future. He had an excellent educational background. Private school in his hometown of Prattville, followed by high school in Philadelphia, then a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Alabama. Now he turned his thoughts to higher education. Borrowing $1,400 from his grandmother's sister in Connecticut, he sailed for Europe to attend the great universities of Germany. In 1868, he was back home, a skilled violinist, fluent in languages, and saturated with the culture of the old world. Tucked in his trunk, in addition to a Master of Arts degree, was a doctorate with highest honors from Heidelberg University. He accepted an appointment as Assistant State Geologist of Mississippi and Professor of Chemistry at the University in Oxford. Both positions prepared him well for his life work that began in 1871 in his native state and ended with his death in 1927, a span of more than 5 decades. What he accomplished against monumental odds became the catalyst that transformed Alabama from an aimless and poverty-stricken agricultural state to an industrial giant to be reckoned with. How he accomplished what he did, with very little support and hardly any money, gave this diminutive man a statue of mythical proportions in the history of the university and the state of Alabama. 6 years after the burning of the University of Alabama by federal forces, the school had raised one multi-purpose building and reopened its doors to students for the fall term 1871. That building is still in use, and it's called Woods Hall now. Smith took his place at his alma mater as professor of geology and mineralogy. He had an ill-equipped laboratory in the basement and a poorly lighted classroom. He wasted no time, however, with regrets. All his abundant energy and his stout heart he devoted to the revival of the school. He freely undertook any extra jobs that had to be done. He sent to Prattville for his geological collection, his books, and an atlas. He served on a faculty committee to replace the collection of the destroyed library that had been one of the finest in the South. He filled the position of librarian and for a time added acting commandant of the school to his other titles. In the coming years, he helped found the school's athletic program and organized the University Symphony Orchestra, in which he played second violin. In the beginning, not only did the school lack basic equipment and textbooks, but in 1872, faculty salaries lagged 4 months behind schedule. Student enrollment fell short of expectations due to the low price of cotton and the pervasive poverty. Smith was convinced that Alabama's recovery from the devastation of the Civil War depended upon the development of the state's natural resources, as he termed it, the state's vast hidden wealth. With that in mind, he applied himself to convincing the legislature that the state geologist's position should be reactivated. His efforts succeeded in 1873 when he was designated Alabama State Geologist by legislative statute. Though he was paid no salary, he was allotted $500 annually for travel and incidental expenses, $3,000 for the purchase of a camp wagon, plus equipment and laboratory chemicals. Alabama had been without a geologist since the death of the able Michael Toomey in 1857. As most of Toomey's scientific papers and collections burned with the school, Smith had little to build on. Other circumstances were even more discouraging. The camp wagon and the expense account did not materialize. Smith had to arrange a means of travel himself and pay expenses out of his own funds. He requested passes from railway officials. That saved money, but limited the range of his investigations. Any equipage he rented, he had to maintain. Axle grease for the wagon, he had it greased every morning. Blacksmith services, 20 cents to shoe one mule foot, 35 cents for mending the wagon's coupling pole. Varying sums for ferriage across the many bridgeless streams. Night crossings cost more. A driver who cooked and took care of the mules in addition to driving, 50 cents per day. Added to these adversities was the extreme summer weather with the inevitable chills and fevers. Yet Smith still managed to visit every county in Alabama during this first decade. He kept a journal in which he recorded detailed observations, botanical discoveries, and mineral analyses he made. He inventoried industries that had failed or been destroyed, judging whether they were worth salvaging. Interspersed with this information were the comments on the people he met, the frustrations he dealt with, historical notes, and poetic descriptions of rocks and creeks and mountains, giving a vivid picture of Alabama in transition. Early on, Smith focused his attention on the state's crippled iron industry. Federal troops had destroyed 15 of Alabama's 16 producing furnaces, along with their forges, shops, and foundries. He inspected the furnaces that had revived after the war, pointing out in his reports the reason some of them were succeeding, while others were, in his words, not doing so well as expected. In the fledgling Birmingham area, he toured the ore works of Henry DeBartoleben, who was destined to become one of the giants of Alabama industry. Truman Aldrich, developer of coal mines in Montevallo and Blockton, became Smith's close friend and was a welcome comrade on his geological field trips. Future industrial leaders read Smith's articles in scientific journals and his reports and consulted him personally. Ordinary citizens as well depended on Smith's guidance in their enterprises. Throughout the year, they sent to him at the university specimens for analysis, and during the summer, they brought to his camp what they were sure were gold or silver, lead or copper. One of the most difficult tasks Smith faced was shattering their dreams of riches. Many of them, afflicted with what he termed monomania, never accepted the truth. Smith measured everything he saw by the question, how can this be utilized to help Alabama? He tried to transmit his vision to others through his reports. The beds of excellent building stones such as granite, gneiss, and marble, the extensive belts of soapstone for constructing fireplaces, cooking utensils, bakers' ovens, and handsome tabletops, the accumulations of fine porcelain clay, of large asbestos deposits, pits of mica, and the lime for reviving worn-out fields, the graphite of Clay County, the gold nuggets to be found in the streams of Coosa County and in the long-dead mining town of Arbacucci, the turquoise and golden beryl gemstones, the turquoise and golden beryl of gemstone quality, and the extensive spreads of rock suitable for millstones, which were in great demand. He wrote of functioning copper mines and abandoned ones that had possibilities, of the unlimited water power in the remarkable creeks, the beautiful springs that could be turned into health resorts, and always there were the three great coal fields to be assessed, the Warrior, the Coosa, and the Cahaba. Until Smith's day, they had hardly been noticed. In 1879, his evaluation of the Warrior River was aimed at making the stream navigable year-round. His survey had far-reaching consequences for industry and led ultimately to the building of the lock and dam system on the Warrior River. Wherever Smith went, he made notes on plants. In 1880, he and Dr. Charles Moore published the most complete list of Alabama plants so far. He collected rare fossil shells from the Claiborne Bluff, petrified tree trunks from LaGrange, chunks of corundum and tourmaline. So accurate, it endured for decades as the standard work of its kind. With Smith's constant prodding, the state printed the Geological Survey's reports, bulletins, and maps, and made them available to the public. One of Smith's most valuable assets was his ability to attract men of exceptional ability to work with him for no pay. Men like Henry Macaulay, who made outstanding contributions to the Geological Survey. Many of those devoted to the little dock later gave in his honor their prized collections to the beautiful Museum of Natural History at the university named for him. But during the first 10 years, when the museum was only another dream of Smith's, the Geological Survey stirred up widespread interest and helped bring about impressive industrial growth. In acknowledgement, the legislature raised the annual allowance from $500 to $5,000, enabling Smith to pay salaries to Macaulay and his other assistants, but none to himself. However, he got the camp wagon he had waited 10 years for. The Studebaker Special arrived in Tuscaloosa by rail in the spring of 1883, made of oak and hickory, with hinged leather seats that converted to a bed. The deluxe wagon had iron tires and an apron on the back for carrying camp equipment. In the years that followed, wherever the wagon went, in towns or the wild woods, at camp meetings or political rallies, it grabbed the public's attention. People flocked to it, wanting to know what Smith was peddling, clamoring to have their pictures made, expecting a Punch and Judy show or a magic act. And after dark, men disturbed Smith's sleep looking for a card game or whiskey to buy. Despite damage from the deplorable roads and temperamental mules, the wagon usually covered 17 to 25 miles a day. As it jolted along, Smith took notes, made sketches, collected specimens, and quizzed the locals. In camp at day's end, his driver watered and fed the tired mules and prepared supper, while Smith packed the specimens for mailing to the university, organized his notes for his journal, answered mail, received curious visitors. He had to write his letters by lantern light, of course. He spent many a night tending a sick mule. He never lost a patient, though he came close the time old John lay stretched on the ground dying of colic. None of Smith's usual colic remedies had worked. In desperation, at 3 a.m., he dosed old John on a mix of pepper tea, paregoric, whiskey and soda, and went to bed without hope. Next morning, old John was standing on his feet. Not quite ready for work, but very much alive. In the crucial first decade of the revived Alabama Geological Survey, Eugene Allen Smith laid a solid foundation. During the succeeding 44 years of his work, the industrial life of Alabama was transformed. The making of iron turned Birmingham into a booming city. Coal production soared from almost nothing to over 20 million tons annually. The manufacture of cement, fertilizer, and other products flourished. As one authority said, industrial plants emerged from the hillside like mushrooms. Until the end of his life, Smith's thoughts were of Alabama. Only a few days before he died in 1927, the legislature passed a bill that he had requested. It increased the annual appropriation for the Alabama Geological Survey to $50,000, making the survey's future secure. A man who knew Smith well remarked, "He made many people wealthy, but he died owning not 1 inch of the state he loved." This was a difficult book to write. To confine this energetic, intelligent, forward-thinking man to the pages of the book was very hard. I think in the years after this first decade of two outstanding things he accomplished. He did many others, but I think he was the one who got through Congress a bill to repay the university repay the state for the burning of the university. The federal government allowed Alabama to have over 46,000 acres of public land, and Alabama could use it in any way to help support the university. Smith wrote letters and himself went to Washington to get this through, and then the three-man commission that chose the public lands, Smith, of course, was one of them, and he knew Alabama so well and knew the value of the land, so he was an ideal choice. Another important thing he did, in 1911, the Highway Commission was formed. Smith was chosen one of the 5 members of the Highway Commission. Nobody knew the roads of Alabama or had suffered as much from them as Smith had. So he was ideal for that. In working with Smith and his writings, I enjoyed his use of language. He had, he would take jobs with government agencies because as he worked on them, the governments, state and national, would furnish him with instruments, which he could then have for his classroom laboratory. He did it for his students. In 1 year, when 1880, I believe it was, he agreed to do the cotton census. He was absolutely overwhelmed. It included several states, Florida, and he had so many reports, and he had to do his classroom lectures, and he was overwhelmed. He wrote his friend in New York City, "Since Christmas, I just haven't been worth killing." Do you know that feeling? Out in the field, he would sometimes get a violent headache and have to take to his bed. They would have to look for an empty house. Anywhere they found an empty house of any kind, they could set them up in there, and Smith could take to his bed. And sometimes he suffered from what he called the mullygrubs. One time, going along the road, on each side, the garnets, hundreds of garnets, were on each side of the road, so as thick, he said, as bog ore bullets. Now, I don't know what a bog ore bullet is, but I like that expression. He would sometimes ask for refuge in some isolated place. If the weather was inclement or so forth, he would ask a resident there to take them in, especially to give the mules shelter. One old man living alone, Smith approached him, and this man said, "Oh, well, I just am not fixed to have company." But Smith was kind of desperate and pressed him, and so he took them in. But in his journal later, Smith wrote, "I found out, to my regret, that Mr. So-and-so was right. He was not fixed to have company." Smith got so sick from eating the fried fatback and cornbread the man fixed for supper and breakfast that he couldn't sit up on the wagon seat next day. I appreciated getting to know this interesting family. Eugene, Jenny, their 3 sons, and their only daughter, Julia. But I grew too involved with them. I lost my balance. I worried when Smith's sons depleted his bank account so that he couldn't make his insurance payment. I sympathized with Jenny when she couldn't attend a family wedding because she had no dress to wear. Smith wrote a son, "I don't see what's keeping her from going to the wedding. She's not going to be in the wedding." And when Julia died, their only daughter, I had to stop writing for a while. I know that the milieu that I had breathed from the hundreds of old letters I read was a factor in my illness, but I was also grieved for Julia. For me, writing this book was a 10-year adventure with its ups and downs, but I'm grateful to my father for introducing me to the Smith family so long ago, and I'm glad to have some of them here today. Thank you.
We have time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will give you a microphone and speak directly into the microphone, please.
Yes, was Dr. Smith involved in the development of the marble resource around the Sylacauga area, or was that known prior to his appointment as state geologist?
Was he involved in what?
The marble resources around the Sylacauga area, mining of marble.
He
for statues
visited
and
them and he wrote about them. Yes, yes. And then Dr. Gant, I believe. Is that a name? G-A-N-T? He visited his marble works after they were tied up in litigation and everything was in ruins. He wrote regretfully of it. He also knew the sculptor up there and visited with him, the man who made so many sculptures for Alabama. In Birmingham especially, near the library, there are several sculptures that this Italian sculptor did, and Dr. Smith visited with him.
Could we be introduced to Dr. Smith's descendants and how they are related to him?
I'm Aileen Galt. I live here in Montgomery. We are first cousins, fourth removed.
I'm Helen Patton. I live here in Montgomery, and I'm first cousin 4 times removed.
I'm Carolyn Bradbury. I'm from Auburn, Alabama, and I'm first cousin 4 times removed. We have a cousin in Huntsville that set all this up for us, and she is sick and could not make it today, so we feel really bad about that. But anyway, she's a first cousin 4 times removed. Her name is Nancy Howell. Our great-great-grandfather was first cousins with Eugene.
Now, Eugene Allen Smith was connected to the Pratt family, Daniel Pratt's family. His parents had, I believe it was 6 children, but only 2 of them survived to adulthood. Eugene Allen and Julia. And Julia married a Pratt. And young Julia, who broke my heart, she toured Europe 3 times with her rich Aunt Julia. And young Julia had many admirers, and when she sailed from New York, her stateroom was filled with flowers and boxes of candy from the men who were friends of hers. And one summer in Prattville, when Jenny took the children down to stay with the relatives, one of Julia's most frequently mentioned men friends was there from Mobile, but Julia wrote to her father, who of course was away, that he had gone back home, and she enjoyed having him there in Prattville, but because of Mama, she was glad that he left. Now, whether Jenny was pressuring her in some way that made her uncomfortable, I don't know. She didn't say. But young Julia was very intelligent. She majored in languages. She graduated from the female college in Tuscaloosa. She loved her family, and she wrote such wonderful letters to her brothers, cheering them on, The boys were always complaining about their work, their bosses. They needed more money, and always in difficulties. And Julia would write cheerful letters full of affection, encouraging them. And she got into photography and following in the footsteps of her father, and made a marvelous picture. It's in the book. She made it into a postcard of her 3 surviving brothers with her father. And Eugene is small and these big boys around him. It's very interesting. She made it less than a month before she died.
Do we have another question?
What happened to the sons?
We have a question in the audience. What happened to the sons?
The sons, not one followed in Smith's footsteps, but I know why. I think Smith was always poor, and the boys had an insatiable need for money. They worked. Landon was a highway engineer, and he went to France in the First World War. In fact, when he came back, he came here. But he had already married before he went away and had a son. And then when he came back, he married again and had a daughter. And an interesting thing about his wagon, it disappeared from the university basement, Smith Hall basement. And Smith's successor, Dr. Jones, discovered it missing. And he could not find out what had happened to the wagon. And he finally traced it down. Somebody had sold it to the junkyard, Timerson junkyard there in Tuscaloosa for $15. Dr. Jones bailed it out and took it back to Smith Hall and started a drive to renovate the wagon. And Landon's son, in his first marriage, donated $5,000 or $6,000 toward the refurbishment of the wagon. And then, not too many years ago, Landon's daughter, by his second marriage, sponsored a symposium on Dr. Smith at the university. It was marvelous. And so they do treasure their heritage. Landon's son, of course, is not living now.
We have a question in the back.
Tell my recollection here, did he have anything to do with the Wetumpka impact crater? Did he help discover that?
Did he have anything to do with the Wetumpka impact crater? Did he help to discover that?
I did not come across anything about that, but there are many stories in the book of having to do with strange things in the sky and unusual things out of the ground. There are teasers in the book. I didn't trace out some of those things. For example, a well-known sculptor came from New York and stayed 9 weeks or so with the Smiths in Tuscaloosa, and she did a bust of Eugene Allen Smith. Later there was a tragedy in her life when she went back to New York, and the whereabouts of that bust I do not know. Maybe somebody, after reading the book, will pursue that and find where Smith's bust is. It shows, we have a cast of it that's pictured in the book, and he has a bit of a worried frown on his face, but he had many heartaches.
We have a question in the back.
given the season of the year, I have to ask this question. Didn't he start the football team at the University of Alabama?
What?
Didn't he start the football team?
He was a part of it. And baseball he loved. And when he got his new office, when he got his office in the beautiful new Smith Hall, he could look from his office window and see the fellows practicing, spring practice, and he would comment on it. Yes, he was very important. He did not go to the games away from Tuscaloosa, but he was right in there supporting in every way he could the football and baseball team, and he took a big part in the field days the university would have every year. He would be a judge and a planner. He was a power. Was not as tall as I am. I believe he was about 5'4", and diminutive with that, but he was tough.
Ms. Henderson, would you comment on the map that he developed, and what year was that map? And is there, I guess there's a copy of that map in your archives?
Yes, at the Hoon Library. The Geological Survey Library at the university. Smith got lost many times. Roads were not marked, and the roads were so terrible they broke his wagon down, and they would stay by the side of the road waiting for help for hours. He made careful notes of corrections. The U.S. map of Alabama had places in the wrong place, things in the wrong place on the map, and he also was alert. He knew of Mr. Cram, who was with a railroad in Birmingham, and he had taken a map of Alabama and cut it into squares so that it was hinged. And this railroad man had also made many, many corrections. When Smith saw in the paper that Mr. Cram died, he immediately wrote to the influential men he knew in Birmingham and said, "Can you get this map for the Geological Survey? This is very important for us to have." And he said, "Whatever anybody offers to pay for it, I will pay more." And that's at the Geological Survey or the Who Library one. I can't remember right now. I think it's a Geological Survey building, but they could certainly tell you it's a marvelous thing. Hinged. It's marvelous what Smith, out of his meager funds, what he did for the university and the state. But I got a strong feeling his family suffered, especially the two women of his family. If you read the book, you'll see why I broke down over Julia.
May I find out from you today when the Summer of the Bone Pile Monster will be republished?
It's supposed to be in print now. The Summer of the Bone Pile Monster, I wrote, it was published in 1995, and it won 2 awards, amazingly. And its popularity is still strong. Do you know, according to Amazon, 14 copies of Bone Pile Monster sold in New York City in the last 2 months. And it's a pure Southern book. And by the way, it grew out of Smith and my research, because in it is a zeuglodon, the whale. I mentioned that Smith was eager to find enough fossil bones to put together a whole zeuglodon. And sure enough, if you go to Smith Hall, stretched across the ceiling is Smith's zeuglodon.
Thank you, Ms. Henderson. She will be here to autograph your books, and New South Books has books for sale in the hallway about Eugene Allen Smith, and Ms. Henderson's daughter, Ann, will have some of her other books for sale here on stage, so if you're interested in some of the other publications. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Ms. Henderson.
Thank you. Take a bookmark if you'd like it.
Congratulations.